Between 1688 and 1714, France was involved in two major conflicts. And I don't want to repeat what Jean-Philippe has really said here, so I'm going to sort of skip slightly the first paragraph of this. I just want to reiterate that there's a temptation still, particularly in the English-speaking world, to bracket together these two wars as the great struggle to stop Louis XIV from becoming a universal monarch. And the danger of this is that we blur the distinctions between the causes and pressures of the different wars. And most problematic, we lose sight of the considerable geostrategic and geopolitical differences between the wars, with their very different priorities and very different knock-on logistical effects. Now, I don't really need to spell out to this audience that there were considerable differences between the two conflicts, at least from the perspective of Versailles. But I will briefly crystallize a couple of the differences. Whereas the 9 Years' War for the French was essentially a fight to secure their frontier zones and preserve their influence in courts abroad, the War of the Spanish Succession was a struggle to preserve a double-headed Bourbon empire, an imperium, in which France provided the international political leadership and military muscle, while Spain provided the flow of bullion, the trade opportunities, and the territorial presence from which derived a great deal of international esteem. And the two wars also exerted burdens upon France that differed significantly in their order of magnitude. And it is on the logistical difficulties France faced and their interplay with political and strategic concerns that I wish to concentrate today. In particular, I shall try to say something new by focusing upon the supply of weapons and ammunition, with some remarks about the vivres too, rather than repeating what I have already suggested in my last two books about the deterioration of French finances. I want to try and build up a preliminary, tentative picture of the patterns of deterioration in French military logistics and how this finally brought Louis XIV to the brink of a complete collapse of his war effort. Now, looking back upon these two wars from the vantage point of 1713, the great munitionnaire Claude Paris de la Montagne noted just how much easier it had been to organise the supply of armies during the Dutch War. It wasn't just that this time France is alone, and as France says, it's proud as well in 1689. There are much bigger problems at work here. Now, in an obvious effort to blacken the reputations of those who had preceded him, Paris de la Montagne thought that there had been some real incompetence by munitionnaires in the 1690s and 1700s, and there was some truth in this. But he also noted just how much larger the armies had become, and how it had become much more difficult to mobilise money. In the 9 Years' War, things had not been too bad. Standing firm on her frontiers and launching only limited thrusts into enemy territory, France had been able to draw upon the still considerable financial strength she had developed between the early 1660s and late 1680s in order to hold off, to sort of push back Allied assaults. Now, frustrating though it might have been, Louis XIV's troops were not operating way beyond his frontiers, with all the problems of supply and pay this entailed, and the inflated costs that this would also involve. Nevertheless, it's worth remarking that by 1693, when the French army was at its largest for the whole Ancien Régime, the process of assembling enough guns, gunpowder and foodstuffs for the men was extremely slow and cumbersome. And on top of this, when the famine of 1692-93 hit France, it pushed prices of food up considerably and made it much harder to get the supplies to the places where they were needed. It became harder to take the offensive in 1693-95, the three crucial campaigns which saw French strategic advantage disappear. And you can see here on the screen, this is the rough areas that France is fighting in. Forgive my rather crude blocking of this in red. Now, I've argued elsewhere some 15 years ago that Louis XIV suffered a major setback at the hands of Vittorio Amadeo of Savoy in 1695-96. As the price of neutralising Italy and boosting his own status and independence, the Duke insisted upon a range of concessions and French withdrawal back into the Alps, abandoning Casale and Pinerolo. This had come to pass because of the inability of the French army of Italy to take the offensive in 1693-94. insufficient troops could be spared for this front. And even then, there were two major logistical headaches. Not enough flour and grain could be stocked in the Alpine magazines during the winters of 1692 to 93, 1693 to 94, and 1694 to 95, in order to allow the army to go on the offensive. It couldn't be done. And Pinerolo was in any case wrecked as a secure supply depot by the Allied bombardment of 1693. My general point here is that however heroic an army and its generals might be, and however successful they might be when on the battlefield, underlying logistical problems can act as a severe restraint upon the successful pursuit of strategic goals. Beyond Italy, in early 1694, it became clear to the French government that only one of its 6 theatres of war could sustain offensive operations, Catalonia. This was the only theatre where there were adequate amounts of arms and ammunition, and where the Munitionnaire of the Vive could get supplies in place in time to launch offensive operations with a chance of securing strategic goals. Major success did not happen in Catalonia that year, but that owed more to the failures, I think, of military leadership. Now, the situation in the next conflict, the War of the Spanish Succession, was really very different. During this war, France had to send large armies into much of Western Europe, as we all know, and Jean-Philippe has been telling us about, and you can see this on the map. Furthermore, with two powers working together, even if Spain was much weaker, Madrid and Versailles needed to coordinate two separate war efforts, two strategic visions and plans, and two sets of logistical needs and systems. The inability to bring things together ruined, for example, any chances of besieging Habsburg-held Barcelona in 1711. Now, the immense geographical scale of French political and strategic commitment cost vast amounts of money, which France in 1701 could ill afford. Although the country had weathered the 9 Years' War without collapse, the French army was stagnant and had been hit hard by demographic crisis in 1692 to 94. The burdens of taxation and huge forced loans on the elites, and the severe contraction in overseas trade during the war had depressed consumption and taxes. And by 1700, this threatened to wreck the revenue system unless there was a decade of peace and recovery. Military contractors had also overextended their credit and needed time to recuperate. And France's currency had lost considerable credibility owing to monetary manipulation, and this was to be worsened by further coinage re-ratings and the issuing of vast amounts of paper instruments from 1703 to 04. And you can see here in this picture here, you can see the understamping there, and then the the overstamping there. These are the coins regularly being called in. Now, in the years after 1700, the flow of Spanish bullion from the New World, brought about largely by French interloping, certainly compensated for France's renewed economic weakness and provided a pool of coin-related credit for royal financiers to draw upon. But it was not enough to make up for the massively inflated costs of fighting a war way beyond the French borders, as you can see here. Indeed, the influx of bullion may have done just enough by allowing France to fight on to really wreck the French economy and financial system, and with it the military logistics, when the almighty collapse finally came in 1709 to 1712. Spanish bullion, therefore, ironically, paved the way for the relatively weak French international position from 1713 to 1740. Now, to compound the problem, France was not able to take advantage of her central geographical position to nearly the extent we might imagine. Internal lines of communication are all very well if those lines are clear. But in terms of hard communications, roads and rivers, and soft communications, correspondence and credit networks, France was decidedly lacking in this period compared to the later 18th century. On top of this, the logistical setup was geared towards war on the northern this is very très sensitive. On the northern frontiers, is where the logistical system is much stronger. There was a significant infrastructure north of Paris, a slightly weaker one in the northeast near the Rhine, and a wholly inadequate infrastructure in both the southeast and the Pyrenees. The southern frontier and war zones had to be supported in both cases from deep inside France. So this war front here is having to be supported by logistical equipment coming all the way down here and all the way from over here. And yet holding together the Bourbon Empire depended upon the French securing Spain and repelling any attempt to re-establish a Habsburg presence there. And it also depended upon the French keeping northern Italy free of imperial forces and holding Savoy in line. That is what France has to do if the Spanish Empire in Europe is going to remain in Bourbon hands. But in 1705-6, however, the Bourbon situation in both Italy and Spain, as we know, collapsed dramatically, permanently in Italy and temporarily in Spain. And I want to look for a few moments at this moment in time. When the Allies and the Archduke Charles managed to embed themselves in Catalonia, the Bourbons were determined in 1705-6 to expel them. But the effort to amass the armament to besiege Barcelona and close down the Catalonia theatre was handicapped by the enormous weakness of French logistical capacity in the southwest. Massive amounts of gunpowder, poudre, and large amounts of cannon had to be sent from all along the Atlantic coast region and also from Flandre, cannon from Flandre for Spain. And the slowness with which supplies were assembled contributed significantly to the failure of Philip V to recapture Barcelona in the spring of 1706. The effort that was made had been all for nothing. In fact, it was worse than this, for the ministers had seen this as a massive one-off investment in shutting down the Catalonia war theatre. It had been costly and draining for France, and on top of this it came at a bad time in the financial world. The need to send more money into Spain coincided with an explosion in the number of billets de monnaie in circulation, and even Samuel Bernard had to temporarily withdraw from much remitting at this time. With the abandonment of the siege of Barcelona, the guns were largely abandoned, falling into Allied hands, and the poudre had to be burnt. As the principal arms coordinator Berthelot de Pléneuf remarked, on aurait fait plus d'attention aux pertes de Catalogne si l'on n'avait pas été encore plus malheureux de notre côté. That autre côté was the Battle of Ramillies in the Netherlands. Here, not only were a fair number of French regiments destroyed in the battle with all the expenses of rebuilding them, the munitionnaires of the Vivres had to be assisted also because of the huge costs they incurred. Magazine stocks had to be rebuilt. The Vivres équipage had to be reconstituted. And it was expensive to evacuate material from magazines in the Spanish Netherlands as Marlborough advanced across the land. And there's Ramillies, just to fix it in our minds. However, in logistical terms, all this paled into insignificance compared with the catastrophe in northern Italy in 1706. The effort of preparing for the siege of Turin led to the complete exhaustion of France's gunpowder stocks and its reserves of gun carriages, even by September 1705. It had been estimated that 1 million livres de pois of gunpowder was required for the siege. And France did not have enough animals to bring the huge quantities of supplies over the Alps in 1705. Once again, the government was engaged in a massive gamble. As Pléneuf explained, if France succeeded, then there would no longer be any need for major offensive operations in Italy, with the implication that resources could then be diverted elsewhere and reserve stocks rebuilt inside the kingdom. The effort was huge, but yet again, it was all for nothing. Yet again, in fact, it was worse than just a defeat. For France had expended vast sums bringing material to Italy, had used up a lot of it, and lost most of the rest, leaving much depleted stocks of gunpowder, guns, and other materiel throughout the kingdom. The French had to abandon so much materiel in Italy because Eugène had captured some 1,400 Bourbon mules before the battle, thus making it impossible for Philippe d'Orléans to remain with the army in Italy. France was now in a desperate situation, compounded by the rapid deterioration of royal finances that year and the collapse of the Munitionnaire de Poudre. The Hogger bankers, looking back in 1710, surveyed les disgrâces qui survinrent en l'année 1706. La levée du siège de Barcelone, la bataille de Ramillies et la journée de Turin causèrent un désordre infini dans le commerce. In the space of less than 5 months, the Bourbon ambition of a double-headed European empire had been shattered. It was now increasingly a question of hanging on in Iberia and keeping the Allies out of France. Now, in the 2 years after Turin, France continued to manufacture large quantities of poudre and armament, but it came at a huge price just as the revenue system was approaching a state of collapse. Moreover, Pléneuf summed up the mood amongst the senior government officials and ministers, a mood which was now bordering on the reckless, telling a colleague towards the end of 1706, au surplus, tout m'est bon pourvu que le service soit assuré et que je préfère encore à l'économie, quoique ce soit une vertu très recommandable en ce temps-ci. In any case, there was not enough materiel being generated. Stockpiles of poudre in the north were not being fully replenished as they were consumed, so there was a gradual diminishing of stocks of the poudre. There were still major problems sourcing ingredients for the munition manufacturers. Saltpeter and copper, cuivre, was now being sought in the East Indies and even Japan and China. A round trip to bring these commodities back to France, which would last between 18 and 22 months. France was also facing a shortage of iron cannonballs, balles de fer, even by the end of 1705. Increasingly, the artillery administration found itself hunting down old metal and old balls in long-forgotten quarters of the artillery network. By contrast, Allied supplies of metal and guns seemed inexhaustible. As Chamillart explicitly recognised, England's tin mines were a great advantage, and the power of the English and Dutch East India companies meant they would never run low on gunpowder thanks to Indian saltpeter. The magazine infrastructure in France itself began to show its severe limitations by the end of 1708, when it became clear to Chamillart that France had too many separate depots throughout the north, and the artillery system was no longer able to take adequate care of the guns, equipment and poudre that was indeed available, so they couldn't look after it properly. When by spring 1709 France found herself mired in economic disaster and financial collapse, Pléneuf told Chamillart no offensives could be mounted with any hope of useful strategic results in any theatre of war. Artillery and animals had to be brought from Alsace to Flandre, simply to allow the army of Flandre to hold off further Allied incursions. In Iberia, atrocious roads, lack of carts and mules, a collapse of the vivres, and a sclerotic commercial sector meant that the Franco-Spanish war effort could only get started and start in a feeble, weak manner late in the campaign season. Because of this, no siege of Barcelona could be mounted until 1714, thus ensuring Louis XIV's Spanish ulcer continued to bleed. Now, at this point in 1709, things began to get really serious. I would like you to imagine a mighty ancient oak tree, a chêne. An oak tree, a chêne with a thick trunk. On the surface it looks healthy, it looks flourishing, lots of feuilles, lots of leaves. That is the performance of the army of Flandre at Malplaquet and Denain in 1709 and 1712. But hidden away inside the trunk of the chêne it is being slowly killed, eaten away by a fungus. That is France's logistical system after 1706, and especially after 1709. That summer, the gunpowder contractors again collapsed and production ground to a halt. And Daniel Voisin, the Secretary of State for War, informed the Duc du Maine, Grand Maître de l'Artillerie, Votre Altesse Sérénissime sait qu'il n'est resté dans les places que ce qui est très nécessaire et indispensable pour les garder. In other words, nothing for offensive operations. By 1711, 2 years later, there was even less left in the place than was necessary for their defence. Gunpowder production and flows of funds to the armies was now a mere fraction of what had been possible even in 1706. Moreover, as Marlborough captured fortress after fortress in 1708 to 10, the French found their munitions depot exposed, and they had to evacuate constantly vast amounts of material, only for the process to be repeated once again, once Marlborough had taken yet another fortress. So you're constantly moving your material. For example, in July 1709, 500 metric tons of iron, fer, had to be moved from Valenciennes. Voisin, intensely anxious about a meltdown in his supplies, was forced to spend money on expensive new arsenals in second and third line fortresses. Desmarais' financial expedients, including reorganising the Receveurs Généraux, withdrawing some billets de monnaie and billets de l'extraordinaire des guerres, and disciplining the appropriations system, only managed to allow France to limp on. And without his efforts, France would have collapsed in 1710 to 11. By 1710, what worsened matters was that some of France's richest farmlands in the north were now being taxed for contributions by Marlborough's army. And Desmarais, in 1711, could not stop the almost complete breakdown of the system of routes et étapes throughout northern France. Nor could he prevent the implosion of the Vivres Company. And for expenditure on the fortifications, which was so essential to stopping further Allied advances, Le Pelletier de Souzy was in 1711 given only 12% of the money he needed. Less than a month after the miracle of Denain in July 1712, so in August 1712, it was clear that France was finally scraping the bottom of the logistical barrel. The ancient canons in the Bastille, which had been rejected up to this point, were finally taken to the neighbouring Arsenal to be melted down. And it was no longer possible to move spare gunpowder from southern France now up to Picardy. By November, some regiments had very, very few fusils left, and fusil manufacture had slowed down dramatically because no more walnut, the essential wood, could be sourced for the stocks. And the country had also finally run out of cuivre de rosette altogether. So that France survived the war without a total collapse and capitulation on the model of Germany in 1918 can be put down to several factors. In the first place, the enormous capacity of this country to absorb financial and manpower punishment, owing to its vast size and diversity. And secondly, the determination of financiers, who were also the military contractors, to keep the paper flowing in the hope of personal survival and further personal gain through manipulation. But by 1712, this was not enough. France was reaching the end of the road, and the death of the Duc de Bourgogne generated a profound sense of imminent disaster, leading, as it did, to the complete drying up of all trade in financial instruments. It really is extraordinary that the death of Bourgogne leads to a massive halt in all financial commerce at this time. Just as the country was on the verge of collapse, Emperor Joseph I died in April 1711. And a year later, most crucially, The British government then acted logically on that basis, and in late May 1712 finally decided to order the abandonment of the war effort, at the very moment when, probably unknown to London, France logistically could no longer stand up against the Allied coalition. Desmarets knew, even before Denain, that because of the British, France was probably now saved, because of these British restraining orders that he knew were going to come. And in mid-June, Desmarets urged his subordinates on to a final effort. Nous sommes près du port et il faut redoubler ses efforts pour y entrer. By now, nevertheless, France was capable of a war effort on only one front, in only one theatre, and a one-front effort that would have been about to enter a state of paralysis. It was, I think, the splintering then of the Allied coalition that saved Louis XIV from utter humiliation. To borrow a phrase from the Duke of Wellington after the Battle of Waterloo, it was a much closer run thing than we have generally believed. Thank you very much. Merci bien.